Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our session on the rhetoric of Black women. Or I should say, I'm Dr. Courtney Buggs from Christian Theological Seminary. I am assistant professor of homiletics at CTS and also director of the PhD program in African American preaching and sacred rhetoric. And always glad to be with my colleague, Andre Johnson, and many of you who I've met, and glad to meet some new faces. So we will proceed with our panel in the order that is listed in the program. And for your reminder, that would be McDonald, Woodbury-Moore, Raedorah Stewart, and Jackie Lyde. I apologize if I did not get your name right. Okay, great. So we will continue in that order. As a reminder, presenters, you have 12 to 15 minutes. I'll signal you about 2 minutes out. I'll try to be a little distracting for you. And I will ask you also to introduce yourself with your name, again, your affiliation and research interests. And I won't start the clock until you do that part, and then we'll go into your timing. So with no further preliminaries, Dr. McDonald.
Good afternoon. Can everyone hear me? Wonderful. My name is Nicole McDonald. I am a recent PhD graduate of Christian Theological Seminary in African American preaching and sacred rhetoric. I am also a adjunct professor teaching queer womanist preaching at Chicago Theological Seminary, as well as being an interim senior pastor at Central Christian Church in Indianapolis, Indiana. And so this afternoon, I want to talk briefly about cross-racial preaching. And this particularly stems from my current context of being the first African American woman, African American queer woman, as well, to be the interim of this predominantly white church that has been in existence for over 191 years. And so I start the presentation off with a quote by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And King spoke these words at Western Michigan University in Kalamazoo during a Q&A session with students and faculty on December 18th, 1963. And mind you, King was responding to this question: don't you feel that integration can only be started and realized in the Christian church, not in schools or by other means? So King says, in response, we must face the fact that in America, the church is still the most segregated major institution in America. At 11 a.m. on Sunday morning, when we stand and sing, and Christ has no east or west, we stand at the most segregated hour in this nation. This is tragic. Nobody of honesty can overlook this. Now I'm sure that if the church had taken a stronger stand all along, we wouldn't have many of the problems that we have. The first way the church can repent, the first way that it can move out into the arena of social reform, is to remove the yoke of segregation from its own body. Now, I'm not saying that society must sit down and wait on a spiritual and moribund church, as we've so often seen. I think it should have started in the church, but since it didn't start in the church, our society needed to move on. The church itself will stand under the judgment of God. Now that the mistake of the past has been made, I think that the opportunity of the future is to really go out and to transform American society. And where else is there a better place than in the institution that should serve as the moral guardian of the community, the institution that should preach brotherhood and make it a reality within its own body? So King spoke these words in 1963, and here in 2025, these words still remain true. Sunday morning remains one of the most segregated hours in America, and therefore cross-racial preaching is in fact countercultural. Before the discussion of the particulars of rhetoric and the persona of the preacher, the exegesis of the congregation that make cross-racial preaching effective, one must discuss how cross-racial preaching comes to be in the cultural context of America. What has set the stage for a racially homogeneous congregation's desire to have a leading pastor of a different race and ethnic background? Specifically, what makes predominantly white congregations select a person of color to lead the church as their senior pastor? Strangely enough, for an answer to this question, we turn to the work of Brandon Crowley in his book, Queering Black Churches, Dismantling Heteronormativity in African American Congregations. In chapter 5, A Most Excellent Way, Crowley describes how Black churches are able to successfully queer the church by becoming a church in which queer folks are welcomed, celebrated, valued, with full inclusion into the body of believers. He identifies several pre-existing conditions within the ethos of the church that enables the church to lay the foundation for addressing homophobia and becoming a queered Black church. And the four pre-existing conditions are as follows. The first is that all queered Black congregations began as don't ask, don't tell churches. A don't ask, don't tell church requires queer members to remain silent about their authentic truth, and church members are prohibited from asking the question, who LGBTQ, due to the negative connotations and consequences of answering in the affirmative. The affirmative may create an exclusionary practice of church membership and or leadership labeling queer and lesbian folks as outcasts in the church community. The second pre-existing condition is that these churches who are queered were already ordaining women and were proud that they combat sexism in the church. In Crawley's work, he uses the example of Christine and Dennis Wiley at Covenant Baptist United Church of Christ in Washington, D.C. And he demonstrates this understanding of intersectionality with sexism and homophobia. And through educating the congregation with Bible studies and introducing guest lectures, they were able to elevate the first female pastor and the full inclusion of the LGBTQIA++ community, which shifted the church's ecclesiology. So Crawley affirms that eliminating sexism in the church is a precursor to queering. The third pre-existing condition is the affirmation of Blackness. The affirmation of Blackness in a predominantly Black church sounds like a given, a no-brainer, if you will. However, due to the assault of white supremacy and racism in America, the affirmation of Black people and Blackness in an African American church cannot be taken for granted. That James H. Cone, most notably known as the creator of Black liberation theology, he notes that he began reading or rereading Malcolm X for a deeper understanding of Black power as a response to Black self-hate. And this created from the adoption of white supremacist readings of the gospel. So Cone concludes that Malcolm X was correct with the indictment that the worst crime committed by white men was to teach Black people to hate themselves. And furthermore, Cone says, I was fed up with conservative Black churches preaching an otherworldly gospel as if Jesus had nothing to say about how white supremacy had created a world that was killing Black people. So the fourth and final pre-existing condition is the commitment to justice. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King states that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And queered Black churches demonstrate a commitment to justice that includes the LGBT QIA++ community, also Black women and Black men, and any and everyone who are experiencing injustice or unjust systemic conditions, including poverty, racism, sexism, and other isms. And so, as Crawley indicates, these four pre-existing conditions, don't ask, don't tell regarding sexuality, the ordination of women addressing sexism, and the affirmation of Blackness confronting self-hate, and lastly, the commitment to justice, set the stage for a Black church to successfully become a queered church. Ironically, these same pre-existing conditions parallel to the historic landscape of my current ecclesial context, a predominantly white congregation that selected a Black queer woman as their interim pastor in Central Christian Church. And again, this is a predominantly white Disciples of Christ church located in Indianapolis, and it was established in 1833. So when we continue to look at Crawley's work with the parallels of the African American churches dismantling heteronormativity, to that of a predominantly white congregation to address racism, Crawley identifies several categories of queer churches. The first is a denominationally queer church. The second is a pastorally queer church. And the third is a don't ask, don't tell church. And last is a congregationally queered Black church. Now, Central has traversed all of these categories over the years, not in sequential order. And based on Crawley's analysis, Central is a spiritual space and with inclusive possibilities or an adaptable congregation, if you will. So when we look at Central being a denominationally queer church, in 2013, the General Assembly of the Christian Church approved a resolution that granted the LGBTQIA plus persons with full fellowship within the Christian church, including clerical ordination. Now, this was not without a fight. There's stories about people losing their bid for the general president because they were accepting and welcoming of the lesbian and gay and queer community. And so before the Disciples of Christ became a denominationally queered church or denomination in 2013, Central was actually a church of don't ask, don't tell because of the stance of the denomination. Secondly, as a pastorally queered church, they were again already ordaining women. Central has been known to or not only ordain women, but ordain Black queer women over the years in Indiana. And also, just so you know, Indiana is an open and affirming region in the Disciples of Christ. So before my predecessor, Linda McCrae, came to Central, they had a pastor by the name of Barbara Blaisdell in 1990 through 1997. And when I take a cursory look of Pastor Blaisdell's pastorate, this is the time period where Central really represents the pastorally queered church. Crawley mentions that in this period, it is substantiated by the congregationalist trust in the pastor and pastoral advocacy. These are the two ways churches become pastorally queered. So during Blaisdell's pastorate, it was during the height of the AIDS and HIV epidemic. And so Central was heavily involved in providing pastoral support to all people during this time frame. So the third category is don't ask, don't tell. And as I mentioned previously, Central was don't ask, don't tell prior to 2013 when the denomination became an open and affirming denomination. The fourth and final category is a successfully queer church. As we continue to look at the relation of a successfully queered Black church and a predominantly white church moving towards accepting Black leadership, this really connects the two pre-existing conditions of affirming Blackness and becoming committed to justice. So Central attempts to affirm Blackness through the adoption of anti-racism training, and they've adopted these anti-racist values as the church culture. Now, we can negate how much of the adoption is really embedded. They're still working on the embedding the anti-racist values into the fabric of the church. But these values are expansive inclusivity, abundance, responsible interdependence, inherent worthiness of all living beings, transparency, collaboration, and cooperation. And there are ways that they're trying to adopt these values. So when we look at these four existing conditions and the four categories of queered churches, these two concepts really set the stage for a predominantly white congregation to accept a Black queer woman as their senior pastor. And so after the selection of the Black queer woman, the question begets, what makes the preaching effective? And I believe the answer lies in the commitment to a justice-oriented gospel. I think that's primary. And then there's other things that help. It's the exegeting of the congregation, the persona of the preacher, and as well as the sermonic delivery of the preacher. And so for these last few minutes that I have, I'll just try to talk about a justice-oriented gospel. So Central Christian Church is a church that admonishes the white Christian nationalist movement and the surgency of it in America. So even though the impetus of justice-oriented gospel comes from a vastly different personal experience between African Americans and white persons in America, the agreement of justice binds this relationship. And said I wasn't going to tell anybody. James Cone, the Black liberation theologian, says as he was thinking about Black liberation, I quote, "I was thinking about God from the bottom and not the top, from the experience of the powerless Black oppressed and not from that of the powerful white oppressor. It was clear to me that those who condemned Black power were blind to the ideological dangers present in white, evangelical, liberal, and neo-Orthodox theologies in America that either embraced or ignored the role of white supremacist ideals in their churches." Central is a church that just objects and just rejects white supremacist ideology. Even so, they've had book studies on ex-evangelicals by Sarah McCammon. This was an adult education class where many of members of Central come from that evangelical church and no longer believe the ideology in the white evangelical church. Also, there's statistics from the congregation that indicate Central is comprised of mostly middle and upper class educated white folks with over 30 retired DOC clergy. And so therefore, they have this belief in a liberative gospel. Oh, that's my time.
Thank you. Thank you so much. You'll get a chance to maybe just put a bow on it when we get
Sure.
the Q&A.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you so much. All right, we're ready for Dr. Woodbury-Moore, please.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, everybody. And thank you for having me. I am the Associate Director of Doctoral Studies at Memphis Theological Seminary. My research interests are all things Black women, and I'm also very interested in helping the DMin students transform their projects into resources for the community. So I'll start. I found God in myself and loved her. I loved her fiercely, an empowerment ethic for Black women. The last lines of Notizoki Shenge's For Colored Girls says, "I found God in myself and I loved her. I loved her fiercely." This was the culminating moment of the play where the women, Black women, finally recognized the divine within each of them. The vision of this work is that women would find power, value, and worth in themselves. They would learn to choose themselves out of love. The shift so desperately needed in the lives of African American women today is the courage to choose themselves. Black women are socialized in a way that encourages martyrdom and self-sacrifice. Black women are tired of putting their needs on the back burner. From the making of a slave to the value placed on Black bodies today, one can attest to the ways Black people have been conditioned to see themselves as the least and the left out. This issue is further compounded by the distinct situation of the Black woman. For as long as we can remember, Black women have been relegated to the background or non-existent. She travels a unique path in the world, one burdened with a history of sexual exploitation, controlling images, and the expectations of white society and Black society on her shoulders. Dating back to slavery, the Black female slave held a peculiar place in slavocracy. Her role as workhorse, sexual object, mistress, and breeder solidified her place in society. Even after coming out from under slavocracy, the values of the slave system were so embedded in society that Black female bodies continued to be demoralized by society. Even today, Black women must contend with archetypes like Sapphire Mammy, or the angry Black woman that seek to manipulate their humanity. To ensure Black women were understood as inferior and immoral, the Cult of True Womanhood, published mid-19th century, articulated the attributes of true white womanhood. Those attributes of true womanhood by which a woman judged herself and was judged by her husband, neighbors, and society could be divided into four cardinal virtues: piety, purity, submissiveness, and domesticity. This is a stark contrast to Black women whose clothing was constantly stripped, who worked in the field and were breeders. To be clear, I define Black women as any woman whose cultural origin is the continent of Africa and who identifies with the historical struggle of African people living in the diaspora. To combat the physical, emotional, psychological effects of an oppressive society, one develops coping strategies that reinforce the devaluation of the self. Shifting, as described by Therese Jones and Dr. Shorter Gooding in Shifting, the Double Lives of Black Women in America, is one strategy. Shifting is the way in which Black women adjust or accommodate others based on the context they find themselves in at the time, forcing themselves to choose between a white standard or their own culture. Keisha Scott explains in her book, The Habit of Surviving, Black Women's Strategies for Life, that the habit of surviving is yet another method of coping. Habits of survival refer to the external adjustments and internal adaptations that people make to combat economic exploitation and racial and gender-related oppression. Shaniqua Walker Barnes in Too Heavy a Yoke, Black Women and the Burden of Strength, says that the strong Black woman is yet another coping mechanism. The strong Black woman image enabled survival, allowing Black women to repress grief, sadness, and anger. However, over time, the armor is welded onto the bodies, giving way to fear of vulnerability, decreased capacity for emotional intimacy, and help-seeking. Thus, a need for a way forward that gives Black women full ownership of their journey. I posit a womanist empowerment ethic that speaks to the experiences of African-American women and attends to their unique needs as women of color. For me, empowerment for the African-American woman is a process of agency, self-discovery, and community reformation that allows Black women to unashamedly and unapologetically be their authentic selves in the face of people, systems, and structures that covertly and overtly encourage them to conceal parts of themselves, if not all of themselves. Agency. At the center of any discourse on empowerment is liberation, and what liberation may look like for a particular context. For Black women whose personhood and voice have been relegated to the background, or in some cases non-existence, agency is liberation. Agency is giving voice to silence. It is the ability to say it, even when it is risky. There's a powerful scene at the end of The Color Purple that embodies agency. Albert says, "Now what's wrong with you?" Celie says, "You low down dirty dog, that's what's wrong. It's time for me to get away from you into creation, and your dead body be just the welcome mat I need." For the first time in the movie, Celie speaks up for herself. For the first time, she is not passive nor submissive. She is not docile or obedient. Celie finds her voice and she really gives it to Mr. the same way he has been giving it to her in the past. This is every woman's hidden desire, the freedom to say what's on your mind in the face of fear of abandonment, rejection, or physical harm. To be empowered is to exercise agency, the capacity to assert oneself, to stand firm in one's position. Agency is freedom. Self-discovery. The second tenet of empowerment is self-discovery. Shaniqua Walker Barnes posits that in order to get out from under the labels that confine Black women, specifically Barnes says that we cannot exchange one problem for another. Rather, the goal is of healing. It is not a concrete image, but a new monolithic Black womanhood. Rather, the goal of healing is to embark on the journey of self-discovery and self-definition. Thus, the appropriate question that pastoral care should help strong Black women to answer is not who should we be, but how do I discover who I am? Therefore, self-discovery is more about acceptance rather than critique. Self-discovery starts with who am I when I take all of this shit off of me, the stuff that I've agreed to wear or have been coerced into wearing. Self-discovery is a reorientation to our humanity, It screams, I am human first. I am not a machine. I am not a workhorse or a robot. I am a human being who needs care, appreciation, and rest. Despite the liberating traditions of women's inclusion within the ministry of Jesus, women have often been omitted from true community. Black women in particular have on one hand always been highly visible, and on the other hand have been rendered invisible through depersonalization of slaveocracy and subsequent racism, classism, and sexism. This veiled existence is further exacerbated in the home and in the workplace as Black women are taught talk to rather than talk with. They are often seen working and doing, but rather at the table sharing their thoughts. They are encouraged to take an active part in forming and reforming their community in ways that nurture and support and love them. Black women need permission to choose your community. And while we are not able to choose our family, we are able to choose who we will allow the privilege of taking up space in our lives. The ability to form and reform communities allows us to control who we let in and out of our lives. Shane Gay's I Found God in Myself, or the entire Coria poem for that matter, is not about women finding the Christian God. Instead, it is about women who find the little God, not as an externally sought after force, but within themselves, a force which asserts their own beauty and self-worth. This this agency, this power that resides within Black women to choose themselves, to say no when necessary, to love whom they choose and reject any and everything that gets in their way. This is the self in its fullness, to recognize that what we have been looking for all along has been in us the entire time. And I would take it a step further and agree with Lucy E. Campbell, who says in the old hymn of the church, it is something within. No discourse about Black women, womanism, or liberation could be complete without a word about the Black church. The Black church has been the central and most pivotal institution in the lives of Black folks since the days of slavery. However, the Black church has been a thorn in Black women's sides as it continues to perpetuate oppressive ideals regarding the role and place of Black women. A theology of empowerment means the Black church must take seriously its prophetic role in regards to women's self-esteem. The church must be committed to agency, helping Black women find their voice, their passion, and their cause in life. The church is then called to create space, sacred space, for women to be, minus the hats that they wear. Lastly, the church is called to take the risk in utilizing non-traditional sources like Shangays for Colored Girls to connect with the lived experiences of women. The shift so desperately needed in the lives of African American women today is the courage to choose themselves. This vision of this work is that women would find power, value, and worth in themselves. Empowerment for the African American woman is a process of agency, self-discovery, and community reformation that allows Black women to unashamedly and unapologetically be their authentic selves in the face of people, systems, and structures that covertly and overtly encourage them to conceal parts of themselves, if not all of themselves. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And to Raedorah. Stewart, I think I saw you earlier.
Yes, I'm here. It's so good to see everybody. May I share a screen? Thank you so much. I am honored to be a part of this inaugural conversation, and I'm so excited for the first time to see Andre in person, because every time he says, "Can I pray for you?" I'm like, "Oh yeah. I'll do in prayer. Listen." So I appreciate you all. I am, and I like to introduce myself as the Reverend Dr. Raedorah Stewart, because it is important to me to identify both as belonging to the church and to the academy, and what that means to me as a Black woman who is rare in both places is that it shows the place and the possibilities for those who come behind me. And so that's how I usually introduce myself. I'm the director of the Writing Center and Adjunct Faculty at Wesley Theological Seminary here in Washington, D.C. And I'm also an associate minister and artist in residence, liturgist, and painter at Covenant Baptist United Church of Christ here in Washington, D.C. Southwest, Ward 8. And if you know anything about the politics of the region, you know how important that is to make that distinction. And so I'm honored today to share with you a forthcoming book, Hear the Spirit, Ritual Poems and Radical Litanies, celebrating community, faith, and social justice through theopoetic expressions. Well, wait a minute, it looks like I'm covering up part of that. Hang on. The idea of the ritual poem and radical litany comes from the work and the calling that I do as a poet and as a preacher. And as a poet, I would always say, and like the poets are the prophets and the prophets are the poets. And so this is the epitaph to my book, Speaking from the Wall. Every time the wall, the prophets would do. Listen to me now, but hear the Spirit. With ritual poetry, I glean from Black sermonics. And anytime there was a time to give a speech. And so a lot of these poems originated from a long experience of speaking in church. Radical litanies embrace our call and response, the Afro-ethnic discipline or art of call and response. One of the things I like about interactive radical litanies, call and response, is that you have the participation of the congregation and the leader, the congregation and the preacher. And what I found in writing so much and listening so much to liturgies is that this is an opportunity for us to draw people into being in dialogue with the divine. And a lot of the poems here, I would like to imagine as part of the Psalms would be songs of ascent. And I'll demonstrate some of those in a moment. But with the radical litanies that appear at the beginning of our services, it brings us into a communal space. The themes are inclusive, and they are, as typical of Black church, everybody has a special day. So the special days are part of this. I'd like a brother to join me in this call and response. We'll read the first couple of stanzas of these. Can I get an amen from a brother who will read with me? Can I get a male reader? Male identified reader.
Yep, I'll read.
Thank you so much, Carl. Mm-hmm. And so as the liturgist, I would say, if the part of the dough is offered as first fruits is holy, then the whole batch is holy. If the root is holy, so are the branches. Sometimes I imagine God made me from self-rising flour, finely milled with leaveners to carry light and increase volume amidst the ordinariness of all creation. God calls me holy. I am woman.
She is woman. Amen.
I am Eve, the part of the dough offered as first fruit. yet maligned for eating from a fruit tree. God calls me holy. I am woman.
She is woman. Amen.
I am Hagar. I saw God. God saw me. I first called him El Roi, God who sees. So I endured being enslaved because God promised my sons would be free. God calls me holy. I am woman.
She is woman. Amen.
And this particular call and response allowed for not only both male and female voices, or male identified and female identified voices, but it was a celebration of womanhood, and it was around a Women's Day call and response. And the use of the very familiar baking, the use of that imagery is important. So when I write the litanies, I call for personal reflection and communal participation, as we just demonstrated. One of the things that's important, I think, to Black church culture is the duality of I and we, as opposed to colonized Christianity, where there is so much I, my. Whereas in Afrocentric culture, we and us and our, the communal is part of our language. We really embrace the heart to heart and breast to breast type of fellowship. And in reading the litanies and sharing these call and responses, it brings to people, we are then on one accord. If you're not familiar with theopoiesis, theopoetic expressions is the blend of theology and poetry. I found that as a poet, that I was able to speak and take poetic liberties, not only in the sermons, but also in the poetry and the litanies, to bring in my African heritage, to speak to womanist ethics, to address queer inclusion, and the performative of the call and response as Black witness. And when you bring in poetry, the same thing with hymnody, it enhances your spiritual discourse. It is most empowering to hear someone repeat a line or a stanza from one of the poems. And poetry, as the poet, it invites diverse voices indeed. This is one of the invitations where we invoke together, and notice the use of the collective we and us, as opposed to God, I thank you for, but it is God, thank you, God, for accepting our invitation to dwell with us. Thank you for making a tabernacle for us together. Thank you for the power of the Holy Ghost that compelled us to meet with you and fellowship with one another this morning. And so throughout these litanies, you will find a very intentionality about being communal in the language. And unless it was a personal reflection, I very seldom will write or share for public consumption the word that is singular or personal. An important part of looking at the intersectionality of spirituality and social justice is a great part of this book. When I talk about the phenomenology of this work, Hear the Spirit, I want to capture the complexity of our faith, to connect our sacred beliefs with everyday social realities. The reading and the public performance of these words, whether they are as individual poems or litanies shared with the congregation, emphasizes that our spirituality is not isolated, but is intimately linked to our social justice. And it is typical of the Black church that our faith foundation is the catalyst for our social justice movements. And so the litanies further infuse our faith with activism. And as I'll demonstrate shortly when I share part of the table of contents with you, I am intentional about writing litanies that address systemic issues and reflect on them in the context of the communal church. And of course, it encourages moral accountability. And here the spirit, there would be distinct voices of womanist, queer, Black, African perspectives. There are also Latino expressions and celebrations, because those are the persons who are part of the congregation here at Covenant. With this work, I'm able to name the intersectionalities of identities and to bring marginalized voices closer to the center around spiritual narratives, as opposed to just adopting or adapting very common language that excludes or just doesn't, you know how you get a suit but it's a little too big, you have to tailor it a little bit. It's tailored for us. And so this calls for a voice to inclusive practices within the congregational settings. One of the most, I think, read or requested womanist poems that integrates the theology of God and the feminine God, and my familiar with my sacred is the poem When Mama Was God. She made miracles happen in the middle of a Houston ghetto, the center of my universe indeed. She walked on water in 3-inch heels, matching bag with us 5 kids in her footsteps. She taught us to fear not night lightning, thunderstorms, hard work, new things, good success. And as you see, each of the first lines actually coincide with very familiar sermons that are preached about miracles, walking on water, and the fear not of God. Here the Spirit celebrates inclusivity. And in writing for everybody and looking, and as a poet, you know, we observe. And so we are always in your business, even when you don't know we're in your business, by observing. But the litanies invite all to participate. And I actually spend time celebrating different awareness days throughout the book that include everybody within this conversation. And it encourages our congregation to address contemporary issues and fosters a community that reflects unity and diversity, rather than saying those people are them, but they and them are part of me. The prayer, there's a popular song around Advent that says, "Mary, did you know?" And I posit in this poem that, yeah, Mary knew. And this is what I imagine Mary could respond. "Lord of all creation, you who chose me, humble daughter of Israel, how do I answer when they ask, did you know? Did I know? I knew the weight of angels' wings in the air that morning, heavy with glory. I knew the fear that made my knees weak and courage that came down unexpected, unstoppable. I knew what it meant to say yes without understanding all. Did I know? I knew the flutter of divine life beneath my heart, the stirring of eternity in my womb. I knew Elizabeth's joy, the leap of John. The prophecies tumbled from her lips like living water. I knew my song would echo through generations. Did I know? I knew the pain of birthing God, the holy terror of holding infinity in my arms. I knew the shepherd's wonder and Magi's gifts. Simeon's prophecy pierced like a sword. The midnight flight to Egypt, my child pressed close to my breast. And this poem goes on with more observations and Mary's responses to "Did I know?" And notice here there is the intonations of motherhood and birthing and lament, as well as the very common lament of mothers today when we hold our children and then have to engage with what the possibilities are for their lives. The book is laid out as in following the order of the Christian liturgical calendar. And that's very unusual. So instead of beginning this book with, as some liturgical books begin with January through December, I actually began writing it at Advent, and it ends in ordinary time. But before the Advent, it's a series of prayers and invocations, and at the end of the book, it's a series of benedictions. So the bulk of the book, Hear the Spirit, begins at Advent and it ends in ordinary time. Within that structure, I interject cultural and multicultural observances, monthly social awareness days, you know, those days that you wear certain colors for whatever the awareness is, and memoriams to some of the greats of our culture.
Dr. Stewart,
Yes.
excuse me. We're right at time, so I'm going to ask you to just give us one sentence to wrap it up, and then we should have time to come back to you just briefly in the Q&A.
That's wonderful. This is a great place to stop. This is a sample of the layout of the book. And because we're in Lent, I wanted to just demonstrate to you how I cover the Lenten movements in the first part, but also in April, I pay attention to Black maternal health, victims of violent crime, National Crime Victims Week, mental health awareness, and Washington, D.C. emancipation. Thank you for the opportunity to share. This is published by Within stock, and I just found out from the publisher that it will be available early fall. Thank you for allowing me to share.
Thank you so much. Wonderful. And Dr. Lyde, is it?
It is.
Okay.
Good afternoon. Thank you, fellow panelists of the Rhetoric of Black Women and the chair of the panel, Dr. Courtney Buggs. It is an honor to present at the inaugural Center for the Study of Rhetoric, Race, and Religion virtual conference. Thank you to all those who are investing in my educational growth, particularly Reverend Dr. Andre Johnson, the chair and professor, Dr. Janie Hardin Fritz of the Department of Communication and Rhetorical Studies at Duquesne University, all of our faculty, PhD students, and alumni. A special thanks to alumni Reverend Dr. Rodney Lyde, who's also online and is my pastor and husband. I am Reverend Jackie Lyde, a first-year PhD student at Duquesne University with research interests in communication ethics, rhetoric, race, gender, and religion. I will start with an excerpt from Kamala Harris. With this election, our nation has a precious, fleeting opportunity to move past the bitterness, cynicism, and divisive battles of the past. A chance to chart a new way forward, not as members of any one party or faction, but as Americans. This excerpt from Kamala Harris' 2024 Democratic National Convention speech was delivered during a pivotal election moment when she sought to reaffirm the foundational principles of democracy against rising authoritarian and plutocratic forces. As the sitting vice president and the Democratic nominee for president, Harris used this speech to call for unity, justice, and civic responsibility, urging Americans to embrace a vision of democracy that was inclusive and equitable. However, despite her emphasis on democracy, on democratic integrity, her message was met with resistance, illustrating the ongoing marginalization of Black women's political rhetoric in American public discourse. My work in progress is entitled Turning a Deaf Ear, the Pejoration of the American Dream. The phrase turning a deaf ear is often used to describe an intentional refusal to listen or acknowledge an inconvenient truth. In the context of American political discourse, it signifies the systemic dismissal of Black women's rhetorical contributions, especially when they challenge established power structures. This turning a deaf ear has profound consequences, not only for those whose voices are ignored, but also for the entire Democratic electorate and process. It seems that many turned a deaf ear to Kamala Harris, who promoted American democracy for all. It is apparent in my initial analysis of her speech that Harris' rhetoric emphasized equity, justice, and the inclusion of all citizens in the democratic process. These are hallmarks of effective American public speech. Yet the resistance to her message reveals the enduring struggle between democratic ideals and entrenched systems of power. It is ironic then that the then sitting Vice President of the United States and the duly determined Democratic candidate for president could be marginalized and ignored. However, this is not ironic given that Harris is a Black woman who is phenotypically Black, who has Black parentage, who identifies as Black, and who publicly supports and participates in Black institutions. This is a textbook example of what it means to be marginalized. America evidently turned a deaf ear to her inclusive democratic speeches and visions, doing so over and against the obviously plutocratic and oligarchic rhetoric and leanings of then candidate Donald Trump. On one hand, Harris championed a vision of democracy that was inclusive and equitable. On the other hand, look what has been produced 2 months into this new administration. He is doing what he said he was going to do. In his speeches, candidate Trump leaked the implementation of Project 2025. According to my analysis of Harris' DNC speech, it is appropriate to say that Harris told us so. But the fact is that a large enough portion of America turned a deaf ear, as evident by the many people that stayed home and switched allegiances. America turned a deaf ear to what it historically wanted to hear about democracy, and what in 2024 it needed to hear. This is worthy to be studied. This presentation is a work in progress, part of an ongoing exploration of rhetoric, religion, and race in American political discourse. The title, Turning a Deaf Ear, serves as a metaphor for the persistent ignoring of Black women's rhetorical contributions in political spaces, particularly when their words and presence challenge dominant narratives and structures of power. The subtitle, The Pejoration of the American Dream, signals the way in which the ideals of democracy, justice, and equality, once heralded as core American values, have been systematically undermined. This word pejoration is the lexical cousin to the word pejorative. In contemporary discourse, traditional American values such as justice, freedom, and civic responsibility have been reframed as antiquated, naive, or even divisive. This pejoration occurs across every sphere: professional, political, ecclesial, personal, public, and social, to our own detriment. When we dismiss these values, we weaken the very structure that uphold democracy and collective progress, once heralded as core American values. We do so by turning a deaf ear and by devaluing rhetoric through the voices and agencies of Black women. That is to say, what the 2024 presidential election cycle revealed is that when Black women speak, what the American electorate needs to hear, ironically, many turn a deaf ear, in large part because of the pejoration of rhetoric. This paper examines Vice President Kamala Harris' 2024 Democratic National Convention DNC speech as an instance of ethical public political rhetoric. However, she is not the first Black woman to whom America has turned a deaf ear. Figures such as Sojourner Truth, Ida B. Wells, Fannie Lou Hamer, Sherry Chisholm, Anita Hill, and Stacey Abrams have historically raised urgent issues of justice and democracy only to be dismissed, vilified, or ignored. The consequences of this collective refusal to listen have been dire. Delayed civil rights progress, the perpetuation of racial and gender injustices, and the erosion of democratic ideals that bridge faith-based advocacy, racial justice, and collective moral responsibility. Through the lenses of womanist theology, Jacqueline Grant, theological anthropology, Dwight Hopkins, and communication ethics, Arnett, Massengale, Baldwin, and Cohn. This paper explores how Harris' rhetorical strategies sought to bridge the nation's divides while confronting the systemic barriers that ignore rather than heed a voice from the center. Her speech, deeply rooted in liberationist traditions, construct an inclusive moral vision, one that calls the nation to a higher ethical standard. However, her campaign's ultimate outcome also reveals the limits of ethical rhetoric in a society that often dismisses prophetic voices, even when they emerge from the heart of American democracy. Womanist theoretical framework is essential to fully understanding the rhetorical significance of Kamala Harris' DNC speech. As defined by Alice Walker, 1983, womanism extends beyond feminism to center the lived experiences, struggles, and survival strategies of Black women. Womanist thought, as developed by scholars like Jacqueline Grant, Katie G. Cannon, and Emily Towns, calls for an intersectional approach to justice that includes race, gender, and class as inseparable categories of analysis. Harris' speech embodies womanist rhetoric by engaging in what Grant describes as a survival theology, wherein Black women's voices and experiences are positioned as sources of moral and ethical guidance. Her advocacy for democracy aligns with the womanist call to dismantle systemic barriers that exclude marginalized communities from political and economic participation. By emphasizing justice, economic equity, and collective responsibility, Harris enacts what Cannon calls an ethic of resistance, using public political speech to challenge oppression and promote liberation. Furthermore, Harris' rhetoric draws on the prophetic tradition found in womanist theology. While her speech may not have been prophetic in the strictest sense, or overtly framed as such, it undoubtedly carried a prophetic undertone by virtues of its womanist leanings. Her call for justice, inclusion, and democratic integrity aligned with the moral urgency and ethical imperative of prophetic speech, even if it was not explicitly framed in religious or biblical terms. According to Emily Towns, womanist prophetic discourse does not merely diagnose injustice, but calls forth new realities by demanding a moral reckoning with structures of oppression. Harris' articulation of the American dream, therefore, is not a passive celebration of democracy, but a challenge to ensure that democracy is realized for all. Her speech explicitly counters what Towns terms the fantastic hegemonic imagination, the ideological myth that sustains systemic inequities by positioning the inclusion of all people as essential to the nation's survival. The womanist lens also illuminates how Harris' speech directly confronts the pejoration of rhetoric itself. Womanist theologians emphasize the importance of storytelling as a vehicle for truth-telling and moral persuasion. Harris employs this tradition by weaving together personal narrative, historical references, and contemporary political challenges to make a compelling case for national unity and justice. Her invocation of her mother's immigrant journey, her experience as a Black woman in politics, and her reference to historical freedom struggles are rhetorical strategies that embody what Dolores Williams calls a rhetoric of survival and flourishing. By applying a womanist theoretical framework to Harris' DNC speech, we can better appreciate how she promotes American democracy and the American dream as inclusive rather than exclusive aspirations. Her speech challenges America to move beyond rhetorical platitudes towards substantive justice, embodying the very ideals that womanist scholars argue must be at the center of any democratic vision. Vice President Kamala Harris' speech at the DNC was not simply a campaign message. It was an effort to reframe the national conversation on democracy, justice, and collective moral responsibility. Thank you.
Thank you so much. If we could just give all of our presenters a round of applause. Thank you, everyone.
Jazz hands, jazz hands.
Yes, we have about 12 minutes where we can give some space for comments, Q&A. If you have some questions that you want to pose to the panelists, I want to welcome you to do that now. If you could just raise your hand so I can see you, and we'll make space for that. If you would like to give a comment, I just ask that you'll keep your comment short so that those who have questions have an opportunity to ask, and our panelists have an opportunity to respond. I see that someone is in the chat, so just give me a second to read that, and I will come to it. Should churches merge without knowing distinct history, heritage, legacy of the Black church, rich cultural contributions, theological insights, communal resilience that have shaped Black faith traditions may be at risk of dilution? Thus, what becomes of the Black church enduring legacy if it's subsumed in a framework that fails to honor its unique identity and profound historical significance? We see this with the banning of books, erasing avoidance of history. And how in the world do they know Do we know they will honor us when we get there? Can they be trusted? From Chadley Richardson. It sounds like you're asking the question of should there be kind of these merging of Black churches that run the risk of erasing Black history. Am I summing that up correctly?
Yes, ma'am. Really, the question I think was geared toward Dr. McDonald's presentation.
That's what I
And
thought.
yes, ma'am.
Okay, yeah, I thought it was going in that direction, but I just wanted to be clear about the question. Dr. McDonald?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at this. So first, I think that Cone would say that first things first, Black church has to not have its own self-hatred and love and affirm Blackness, right? And so it's not only this attitude of merger, but even as the church standalone Black church by itself, we are a part of our own problem of erasure because we're trying to assimilate into white culture with our theological beliefs. Of we have adopted the white Christian nationalist ideologies, right? So that's why I think we have Black people who don't even want to be a part of Black church, but want to be in white space because of our adoption of our own self-hatred. And so when we take this a step further and we think about this idea of merging, I think it depends on what I'm trying to do in my work is analyze my own context and then create an ethnographic study where I can look at many churches who are predominantly white and who have Black leadership. So when I think about your question specifically about this merger of Blackness and whiteness, I really think that it is going to depend on the leadership and how much leadership is trusted, right? Um, to honor Blackness. So I can say in my space, um, I have limited trust, or people trust me somewhat, but also any attacks against me, personally or professionally, I recognize that it's not about me, but it's about what I represent to them as a shift in culture. And so I am in these conversations where like one person said, oh, well, where the church is going, we're not even gonna have an organ. And so this man had no idea how racist he sounds by telling me because I'm here, the direction of the music is going where we won't have an organ. And it's because this white church is centered around classical music, right? So I think it's a matter of the congregation trusting the pastor and allowing the pastor to merge Blackness in different ways, specifically in ways that they can accept, and continue to push that envelope further and further until they're welcoming of Blackness. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any others have questions? Comments for our panelists? I should also ask if any of the other panelists wanted to respond to that question. I welcome you to also.
Dr. McDonald, I have a question as it relates to your conversation about the merging of, or at the very least, inviting Afrocentric things, concepts, principles within a majority white worshiping space. And one of the things I'm thinking about is, in PWIs, there has been a need for culturally relevant support groups, right? The African American Society, the Hispanic group. So, as I'm thinking about the space in which you serve, do you see still this need to carve out a space for, I don't know, Black women, to have and I'm not suggesting that you have separate ministries. I am suggesting that you have something that may cater to the nuances of a particular group, that may not, I don't know, the whole congregation may not get. I don't know. I'm probably asking this just all wrong, but hopefully you get what I'm what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I'll say this. So, I would think that yes, we need space for specific groups to feel more comfortable, to be themselves, to minister to one another. And also, this is not the culture of this church. Right now, we have no Bible study, we have no small groups. Um, that's not the culture of the congregation. And I would say, what I hear you saying is, how does marginalized people in the space build community? Right? That's the
Yeah.
question I hear. And so I want to. So part of my understanding as the leader of this congregation is that there, in many ways, I am not part of the community, because I challenge the congregation about this, because I feel like any healthy relationship, you can address conflict. And people don't come to me with however I have offended them or I said something that they didn't like. They don't come to me. And what I've told the congregation is, when you don't come to me, you are saying, Nicole, you are not part of this community, because you will not engage in healthy conflict. And what I've also understood is that passive aggressiveness is a thing in white space, which I am not familiar with, and it bugs the hell out of me. And so when I get a passive aggressive email, I respond, let's have a conversation. And then we go meet at Starbucks and we talk about it. Those types of things. So how I'm building community is for to I'm holding myself accountable as a healthy member, and I'm trying to get the congregation to hold me accountable too.
Thank you.
You are definitely in a difficult position.
Yes.
We have about 2 minutes, and if I have questions, but I'm going to just leave mine on the paper, and I want to allow each one of our panelists just to give us 30 seconds to round out your portion of this presentation. So soon to be Dr. Lyde, we're going to start with you and then go to Dr. Stewart. So glad to see you. I've seen your work, and this is the first time I've seen you as a person, so that's exciting. And then Dr. McDonald, and then Dr. Moore will end with you. In that order, just about 30 seconds.
Well, first, I'll just say thank you again. And since I didn't get to finish, I will just read a little bit of the ending. The implication of Harris' public political speech extend beyond the 2024 election cycle. Her speech reveals the enduring struggle for justice and equity in American democracy, highlighting the ways in which ethical rhetoric can inspire, mobilize, and challenge systemic injustices. Even in loss, her rhetoric stands as a testament to the power of speech in shaping political and social change. The question remains, will America continue to turn a deaf ear, or will it finally listen to the voices calling for justice, equity, and a truly inclusive democracy? And I really want everyone to hear, even in loss, her rhetoric, our rhetoric stands a testament to the power of shaping political, and social change.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. The catalyst of the work that I do as a writer, I am intentional about covering the Nomo, the Shibboleth, and storytelling. And that touches my Afrocentrism, the marginalized voices, as well as my Texas way of imagery. And so I hope that when you encounter Hear the Spirit, that you will keep in mind that your whole self is called into this work. And the Afrocentric part of us, the southern part of us and of me, and then the shibboleth, in Judges 12, the battle between the Gileadites and the Ephraimites, I believe. When the Ephraimites could not pronounce the word shibboleth, they said sibboleth. I flipped that to say that the gatekeepers are the ones who need to learn the dialect of others, as we did at Pentecost. And so I hope you enjoy the work. And they said it would be out in time for AAR, and I will definitely let Brother Andre know when it hits. Thank you, and the peace of Christ be with you all.
Thank you. Looking forward to seeing that.
Okay, I think I'm next.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, so I am doing this work because I find myself in white space as a senior pastor, and I have several friends of mine who are also queer and Black and find themselves in predominantly white space as well, particularly with the United Methodist Church splitting and that thing. So I I think there's going to be more opportunity of Black queer folks pastoring progressive white congregations in the future.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, I'm next. The problem that plagues the African American woman is personal, as I've found myself giving away myself, like so many women like me, family members, my mother, grandmother, aunts, and cousins, my friends, my colleagues, my mentors and mentees all have had experiences where they found their stuff under the arms of another on its way out the door. I've seen firsthand the ways in which my mother's self-esteem, her voice, even her smile faded away in the midst of a bad relationship. I've watched my friends lose their identity, their sense of individuality and creativity to ensure that their boyfriends and family members didn't feel threatened by their independence and assertiveness. I know what it's like to lose the joy of living, to press myself down to make somebody else feel more important. The loss of myself left me empty and void, and I learned how to detach from my feelings completely to avoid the pain again. Thus, the need for an empowerment ethic that embraces agency, it embraces self-discovery, and it embraces community reformation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Woodbury-Moore. And again, just a hand of applause for all of those who are on our panel today. Thank you so much for your words and your inspiration. Dr. Johnson, do you have any comments before we close out?
Well, no, other than just get prepared for that 3 o'clock panel that's going to be coming up in about 12 minutes. I did drop, if you don't mind me quickly putting on a pastoral hat, I put in the chat the donation link. Hallelujah for the donation link. If you feel led to. I see somebody's already made a contribution, so you can do that as well too for the center as we grow and prosper in doing this. And next up is our next panel at 3 o'clock. Can we show some love to our chair today, Dr. Courtney Buggs, who did not feel it robbery at all to come and to help us out, even on her sabbatical. And I am so grateful and thankful. And I know she's been working on some stuff as well too for publications, but she thought it enough to come and join us today. And I really, really appreciate you and your time and your effort. And thank you for your friendship and your scholarship.
My pleasure. Great to be with you all.
All right, 3 o'clock. Let's come back.